Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people collectively recorded in my trees. Episode 10 is titled Vagrancy. Today's episode is on Mary Verdon. Mary Verdon was my husband's 4 times great-grandmother, and she is a convict and has an interesting story to tell, including quite a few mysteries that I'm still yet to solve. But it also tells of her descendants and how they fared after their mother, grandmother and great-grandmother came out to Australia. Mary Rose Verdon was born in 1806 in Galway Island to Patrick and Margaret Verdon. She was sentenced to 7 years transportation for house robbery. She was a laundress at the time. She left on the 30th of November 1833 on the Andromeda, accompanied by 2 of her male children. Now, this is the only mention of these male children is on the shipping record on her way out to Australia. The 2 boys are not accounted for or mentioned on the arrival books once arriving in Sydney, and they're never again recorded in records. Unfortunately, we don't have the names of those children, so it is virtually impossible to track them down. So the only thing I can assume is that illness took hold of them on the trip over and they didn't survive. Mary arrived in Sydney on the 17th of September 1834. She was assigned to George Freeman in Windsor, New South Wales. She had a son, James, that was born in 1835 in Bathurst. Now, this is a little bit up in the air. Different records account for different dates and different places with James. So based on other documents, I can ascertain that he could have been born in Bathurst in New South Wales in 1832. Others say that he was born in Parramatta, and others say 1834 or 1835. And it is difficult because you can't always rely on death records, because the next generation are usually the ones that you're relying on to fill that information out. So I'm relying on the dates that are put forward in the police gazettes, as I would assume that either James himself at the time or his stepfather would have ensured that accurate information was put through to the police. It's also a little confusing too, because there is a police gazette document that does refer to him as Peter James Verdon, and there's no other official documents that state, or come under any land records or any marriage records under a Peter James Verdon. So maybe that's just what he chose to call himself at that time. So we're going to go with James being born in 1835 in Bathurst, New South Wales. Mary also gave birth to another son, Thomas Southall, on the 26th of December 1838. So she's had, on the ship, it's recorded she has 2 children with her. We've lost track of them. And then within 4 years of coming out to Australia, she has had 2 children, one born with her maiden name and another one born with the name Southall. So the name Southall, then the mystery of that name comes about on the 19th of July 1941, because she was granted permission as a convict to marry Thomas Southall, another fellow convict, in Bathurst. So Thomas was 28 at the time of this marriage and Mary was 35. To give you a bit of background about Thomas Southall Sr., he was born on the 1st of January 1814 in Birmingham, England. He was 19 when he was convicted on the 26th of March 1831. He was charged with entering a dwelling without permission, so the same offence as what Mary had also received. He was a warehouse boy, could read and write. He was Protestant, 5 foot 2 inches, a sallow complexion, light brown hair and grey eyes. And he came out on the Isabella. His sentence was for life, and 2 of his brothers had been sent to Van Diemen's Land 6 years prior. So I'm wondering whether because he already had family members that had been convicted, they decided to give him a higher sentence, whereas Mary's was only 7 years for the same misdemeanour. He left England on the 22nd of November 1831 and arrived in Sydney on the 15th of March 1832, and he was assigned to a Mr. Samuel at Bathurst. He received a conditional pardon on the 31st of December 1847, and so we are assuming at this point that Mary and Thomas are bringing up their son Thomas and also James. However, by 1850, we discover that Mary's not doing so well. So I'm just going to read you 2 articles from the Bathurst papers to give you an understanding of what is happening at this point. It's titled Vagrancy. Mary Southall was charged on Wednesday last with wilfully and obscenely exposing her person on Tuesday in one of the public streets of the town. Mr. McIntosh bowed to the court as the defender of aspersed and calumniated innocence. Mr. Thomas Jones, being sworn, stated that he saw the defendant in a very spirited state on the day alluded to, and although at a considerable distance from her, judged from her gestures and vociferation that she was abusing some person near her. Constable Laver deposed that he saw her do several things very improper in one of nature's fair creation, which, however, did not absolutely amount to exposure of person. When the police attempted to remove her to the watch house, she lay down upon the ground, kicked, screamed, swore, and tore in a most animated manner. It required 4 policemen to carry her person in safety and decency to the watch house, 2 at her shoulders, 1 at her feet, and a 4th to superintend her drapery, which was rendered necessary by the violent contortions of her excited frame. Mr. John Ford deposed that he saw the defendant rolling and tossing about like a ship without a ballast, and from her manner should judge she was top-heavy, that her conduct was somewhat improper, and her carriage inclined towards indecency, but was far too distant to observe an exposure of her person. The Chief Constable produced 2 convictions, one for drunkenness and one for vagrancy, as testimony against the morals of the defendant. Mr. McIntosh, on behalf of his client, addressed the bench and suggested that their worships had only one duty to perform, and that was to dismiss the case. The charge was laid under the 5th clause of the Vagrancy Act, which rendered it imperative upon the prosecutors to prove that actual exposure of a person had taken place, or that the defendant was an idle and disorderly person. In all these points the evidence had failed, and their worships could not travel out of the clause to find her guilty upon another charge. The court was cleared for consultation, after which the bench decided that the evidence was not sufficiently strong to produce a conviction, but expressed the utmost disgust at the woman's abominable and disgraceful conduct. The case was then dismissed. So that was on the 30th of March in 1850. By the 15th of June 1850, we have another article in the Bathurst paper. Not all sufferings of a long train of prosecutions could convince this foolish and miserable woman that a life of sobriety and regularity is the happiest. She was again brought before the police magistrate for about the 120th time, to answer for another added to a long list of sins against the laws which enforce a certain decency and propriety of demeanour in the individual members of society. Constable Finnerty swore that he apprehended her on Monday for being drunk and disorderly in Rankin Street. She had been in town only a few days and had been continually drunk. She had been twice before convicted of vagrancy and had no lawful visible means of obtaining a livelihood. The Chief Constable stated that he saw the defendant nearly opposite Mr. Arthur's Inn on Saturday night, capering and dancing and placing herself in grotesque and obscene postures. He advanced towards her for the purpose of apprehending her, but being observed by Mrs. Southall, she took refuge in Mr. Arthur's. Prostitution was her only visible means of living. She was found guilty and sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment. So Mary Southall was given 3 months' hard labour for vagrancy. So Mary died only 7 years later at Carcoar in New South Wales on the 8th of March 1857. She was 51. Her death record stated she was 45. Her husband, Thomas Southall, was the informant on that death certificate, but her convict records reflect that she was 51. So quite possibly when she married Thomas, she made herself 6 years younger to match his age more closely. By 1856, Thomas Southall was with Anne Letitia Clark, and they had 6 children together from 1858. Thomas Sr. died on the 30th of June 1879 at Carcoar, New South Wales, aged 66. Mary and Thomas's son, Thomas Southall, he married Janet Jessie Ferguson in Mitchells Creek, New South Wales on the 23rd of February 1862 when he was 23. He is recorded at living at Palmer's Oakey Creek, Turin River, New South Wales in February 1869. He was a miner and he became insolvent in August 1871. He again became bankrupt in May 1888. He was a contractor living in Wattle Flat at that time. By 1889 he was living in Sydney, and he died in Granville, Sydney on the 7th of December 1918, aged 79. Thomas and Janet had 9 children. Mary's son, James Verdon, could have been classed as ward of the state. I'm not sure of that. However, there are a couple of little hints. On the 26th of April 1850, at the time Mary was in the courts for drunkenness and vagrancy, an article appears in the Police Gazette stating that James had absconded from L. Freeman, a bootmaker that James was indented to. And he was named as Peter John Verdon in this article. However, the ages certainly match up. And of course, when it is said that he fled to his stepfather, Thomas Southall, then we clearly know that that was James. So the key word here is indented to. Now, that's a term that you usually only find in relation to convicts. So what I'm actually thinking is that he may have been placed as ward of the state due to his mother, and he has then obviously assigned from the institution to have an employer. A few months later, he's obviously gone back because on the 17th of July 1850, another Police Gazette report had included him saying he had absconded from Mr. Freeman a second time, and now he was charged and sentenced to 1 month confinement. All of this, and he's 15 years old. The next time we see him in the records, he's 23, and he's found to be a horsebreaker at Buckingbong Station, which is at Boree Creek, New South Wales, and he's working for a Mr. F. Perkins. In 1860, he's a stockman working for a Mr. Mackenzie in Conago, and this is where he met his future wife, Margaret Sheehan. Margaret had been born in Ireland, and she arrived in Australia on the 6th of May 1857. She listed her occupation on the shipping records as a housemaid. By January 1861, she was living in Conago, most likely working in service at a homestead property, and James and Margaret married in Conago on the 18th of February 1861. By 1862, James was managing Colombo Station at Colombo Creek north of Urana, New South Wales, for a Mr. Jenkins. He worked for both Buckingbong Station and Colombo Station, as well as Widgewa, and they're all properties that are just north of Urana in New South Wales. He worked as a stockman, and then in September 1871 he also became the licensee of the Carriers Arms Hotel near Urana, and he started working at a couple of properties around Boree Creek. So he was working at Emu Vale at Boree Creek around the same time that he had his hotel. And then in May 1884 he purchased Pine Grove. This was a 540-acre property at Boree Creek. He advertised that for sale in 1887, and then he purchased Emu Plains in 1911 at Boree Creek, and that is where he passed away on the 6th of May 1916, aged 81. An article in the Urana Independent and Clear Hills Standard on Friday the 12th of May 1916 announces the death of James. The title of the article is Boree Creek. One of the early pioneers of this district, and a very old Australian native in the person of Mr. James Verdon of Emu Plains, died on Saturday morning after an illness of about 2.5 years. Mr. Verdon was born at Bathurst 82 years ago. As a young man, he first came to the district 58 years ago to break in horses for Mr. F. Jenkins of Buckingbong Station. After some time spent in this occupation, he was put on the stock for a few years. He then took a position as stockman for Mr. Mackenzie of Conago near Deniliquin. It is here that he met and married his wife, Miss Sheehan. Relinquishing his appointment on Conago, he came back again to Buckingbong and accepted the management of Colombo Back Station for Mr. Jenkins. This position he held until he selected land on Emu Plains, where he resided until his death. Mr. Verdon had a family of 13 children, of whom 7 are now living, 33 grandchildren and 9 great-grandchildren. His widow also survives him. One of his sons, Patrick, died in South Africa during the war, and 7 of his grandchildren are now at the front. Mr. Verdon, from his great knowledge of the district, was looked up to as an authority on most matters connected with the pioneering days. He, until his health failed, took an active part in the local branch of the FNS Association, being vice president for several years. The funeral took place at the Boree Creek Cemetery on Sunday and was one of the largest ever seen here. The Reverend Father Hanrahan officiated. I'm just going to go through each child that James and Margaret had to give you an idea of how they led their lives. So the first child of James and Margaret was William James Verdon. William was born on the 21st of December 1861 in Conago, New South Wales. He purchased land at Urana on the 30th of December 1884 when he was 23. He married Ada Armstrong in Narrandera on the 22nd of February 1888, aged 26. And he died in Narrandera on the 19th of February 1921, aged 59. They had 6 children, and one James died in World War I in France. James enlisted in World War I at Cootamundra in New South Wales at the age of 24 on the 21st of January 1916. He was a labourer at Ardlethan prior to his enlistment. He embarked on the Arcadian to Alexandria and then went on to Marseille. He died on the 27th of April 1918 in France. He was wounded in the left thigh during a battalion attack on Villers-Bretonneux on the 24th of April 1918. He was evacuated to the 10th General Field Hospital at Rouen, where he died 3 days later at the age of 26, and he is buried at the Saint Sevier Cemetery. There was a short article mentioned in the Lockhart Review and Oaklands Advertiser on the 15th of May 1918. News came to hand last Thursday that Private James Verdon, fighting at the front, had died from wounds. The deceased was well known here and was very popular. He was the eldest son of Mr. William Verdon and grandson of the late James Verdon and nephew of Mrs. F. Grogan. Rest in peace. The second child, Mary Ann Verdon, was born at Colombo Station on the 19th of April 1863. She married Edward Curfey at Urana on the 11th of March 1881 when she was 17. Edward was 31. Edward died on the 9th of February 1915 at Mara Station near Wilcannia. He was a well sinker who was killed when struck on the head by a bucket while he was 250 feet below the ground. Mary lived in Narrandera after her husband's death and died in Griffith on the 11th of May 1950, aged 87. And this is just an article in the Narrandera Argus and Riverina Advertiser in June 1950. It says Mrs. Mary Ann Curfey. Mrs. Mary Ann Curfey, who died on the 11th of May after a long illness, was up to the time of her death the oldest inhabitant of the district. She had resided at Darlington Point for well over 60 years and had witnessed many changes in the town. Her sons took part in the First World War, one, Alf, being killed on Gallipoli. As a gesture of appreciation of her sacrifice, the late Mrs. Curfey was selected to unveil the local war memorial when it was erected some years ago. The deceased lady's husband, Mr. Edward Harry Curfey, was killed in an accident in 1915. Mrs. Curfey resided in Audley Street, Narrandera for some years and then returned to Darlington Point 2 years ago. The first son, James William Curfey, he enlisted on the 22nd of May 1915 at Liverpool in New South Wales, and he was an engine driver. He joined the unit on the 4th of November 1915 in Gallipoli. He disembarked at Alexandria and proceeded to go to France, where he was wounded with shell shock and sailed on the Marathon back to Australia on the 19th of April 1919. The second son that enlisted was John Francis Curfey, and he enlisted on the 21st of June 1917 in Narrandera. He started his occupation as a farmer at the time of enlistment. He embarked on the Canberra from Sydney on the 16th of November 1917, and he fought in France. He returned to Australia on the Ulysses on the 15th of March 1919. The third son, Patrick Dudley Curfey, he joined on the 28th of August 1914 in Sydney. He was admitted into hospital at Cairo with a shell wound in the back. He embarked on the Themistocles for 3 months' change to Australia, and he embarked on the Suez on the 4th of December 1915. He was assessed on the 30th of March 1916 in Australia. They had said that the wound had healed. He was walking with a very slight limp, and it was confirmed that he was going to be discharged on the 8th of April 1916 with a pension. Patrick wrote a letter to his mother, and it was featured in the Narrandera Argus and Riverina Advertiser on the 10th of September 1915. It's titled Brothers in Gallipoli. The following letter has been received from Mrs. M.A. Curfey of Darlington Point from her son, Private P.D. Curfey at Gallipoli. Mrs. Curfey had 4 sons at the front. One has been killed, and the writer of the following has since been reported wounded. The letter is written on the back of the Peninsula Press, the 12th issue of the official newspaper published in the Allies Times at Gallipoli. The letter is as follows. Dear Mother, just a word or two to let you know that I am doing all right. But, Mother dear, it is my painful duty, as doubtless you know by now, to tell you that Elf was killed yesterday, 12th of July, with a bullet. He was killed instantaneously, never moved, which is one thing to be thankful for, as he never suffered any pain. So, Mother, bear up, as a brave mother will. You have occasion to be proud of him, as he took part in that great landing on the peninsula, and carried out his duty to his mates in such a way that all hands in the company had a good word for him. He was very well liked in the battalion. So, Mother, bear up with a brave heart, for you have the satisfaction of knowing that he died for the liberty of his country. No more for Europe than Australia, as the people of Australia don't seem to realise what we are fighting for. They ought to talk to men who fought in Antwerp to have some idea what men are giving their lives freely to crush the German power for, and why any mother should be proud to give their sons to the Empire's call. Well, paper is scarce. I will draw it to a close. Your loving son, P.D. Curfey. Alfred Albert Curfey was the youngest of the 4 boys that went to war. Alfred enlisted on the 2nd of September 1914, and he stated that his occupation was a well sinker, so he must have been working with his father in the business. He embarked on the HMAT Euripidia at Sydney on the 20th of October 1914. He arrived at Gallipoli on the 30th of April 1915, and he was killed in action on the 17th of July 1915. This was only 5 months after Mary had her husband tragically pass away. In the Narrandera Argus and Riverina Advertiser on the 10th of September 1915, a small article was placed in tribute to Alfred. Mrs. Curfey at Darlington Point has received a glowing tribute to her son, Private Alfred Albert Curfey, killed in action on July the 12th, from Reverend A. E. Talbot, Dean of Sydney and chaplain, who performed the rites over the deceased soldier in the Gallipoli Military Cemetery. James and Margaret's third child, Francis J. Verdon, was born on the 6th of May 1864 at Colombo Station. He died aged 8 on the 26th of March 1873 after a fall from his horse. Their next child, Margaret Ann Verdon, was born on the 26th of September 1865 at Buckingbong Station. She married Joseph Hopwood in 1885 in Narrandera. Joseph was 9 years older than Margaret, and he had moved from Victoria to Boree Creek in 1880. They had 8 children and lived in the Narrandera and Leeton area. Margaret died on the 18th of February 1937 in Wagga, aged 71. The fifth child, John Verdon. John was born on the 10th of January 1867 at Colombo Station. He farmed at the family property, Emu Plains, and died on the 11th of December 1937, aged 70, at Liverpool in Sydney. He didn't marry. Child number 6, Patrick Verdon. Patrick was born on the 1st of January 1868 at Colombo Station. He enlisted and he was a farmer at Urana at the time of his enlistment in the Boer War in February 1900. He was part of the A Squadron, New South Wales Citizens Bushmen, and was a trooper in the 3rd New South Wales Mounted Rifles. On the 28th of February 1900, he sailed out from Sydney and arrived in South Africa in April 1900. In August 1900, he was in a battle at Eland's River. He died on the 17th of January 1901 at Pretoria from typhoid fever, and he has a memorial at Narrandera as well as in South Africa. Child number 7, Jane Verdon. Jane was born on the 13th of February 1870 at Widgewa, New South Wales. She also died of typhoid fever at Barthawa Station on the 28th of December 1874, aged only 4. The 8th child, Cornelius Verdon. Cornelius was born on Barthawa Station on the 12th of February 1872. He married Margaret Purcell on the 26th of July 1911 in Narrandera, New South Wales, aged 39. He farmed at Boree Creek and in later years lived in Wagga. He died in Wagga on the 18th of July 1934, aged 62. Cornelius and Margaret had 4 children. All 3 boys went to World War II and only one came home. One son, Thomas Cornelius, died aged 25 in Malaya. An article in the Daily Advertiser, a Wagga paper, on the 9th of February 1942 reports Private T.C. Verdon. Mrs. B. Nolan of Ewan Quinty has received word that her brother, Private Thomas Cornelius Verdon, is reported missing in Malaya. He is the eldest son of the late Mr. and Mrs. Cornelius Verdon of Boree Creek and is 28 years of age. Prior to enlisting, he was employed by Mr. Stewart of Tarcutta. Educated at the Christian Brothers High School, Wagga, he has 2 brothers on active service. One brother, Pat, was in the Malayan fighting, while his youngest brother, Kevin, is in Palestine. Private Verdon is a nephew of the Purcells and a nephew of Mrs. A. Grogan of Edward Street, Wagga. On the 16th of January 1942, another son, Patrick John Verdon, was a prisoner of war and died on the Japanese prison ship Rakayu Manu on the 15th of September 1944 at sea, aged 29. The Japanese ship was torpedoed by Allied forces. The third son, Kevin James Verdon, he enlisted on the 27th of May 1941 in Wagga when he was 23. And he was discharged on the 17th of August 1945. He served in Bombay, New Guinea and Lae and received a Pacific Medal. The 9th child of James and Margaret was Annie Verdon. Annie was born on the 19th of March 1873 at Barthawa Station. She is my husband's great-great-grandmother. She married Francis Patrick Grogan on the 7th of January 1892 at Marinda, which is north of Urana, when she was 18 and Francis was 26. Francis owned land at Boree Creek called Adavale. They moved to Wagga in their later years and Annie died on the 22nd of July 1945 in Wagga, aged 72. They had 9 children. An article in the Narrandera Argus and Riverina Advertiser on the 6th of July 1945 outlines an obituary for Mrs. A. Grogan. The death occurred at her residence at an early hour on Saturday morning of a well-known and esteemed resident of Wagga, Mrs. Annie Grogan, of 297 Edward Street, at the age of 72 years. Mrs. Grogan was born at Urana and was the widow of the late Mr. Francis Patrick Grogan of Wagga, who predeceased her 14 years ago. For many years, Mrs. Grogan resided in the Boree Creek district, where her husband was engaged in farming pursuits, and on their retirement in 1920 they went to live in Wagga. Mrs. Grogan was an ardent member of her church and was a member of the Sacred Heart Sodality. She became ill on Friday night last. She is survived by her 3 sons and 5 daughters, 17 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. And the 10th child born to the family, Francis John Verdon. Francis was born on the 4th of May 1876 at the family's property Emu Plains at Boree Creek. He enlisted in the Boer War on the 15th of March 1901 and sailed on the Maple Moor. He was in the 2nd New South Wales contingent and was a driver of horses that towed a battery 18-pound field guns. He was a member of the New South Wales Permanent Artillery before the war. He would have been stationed in the West Transvaal and in the Vryburg area and around Standerton. Their division was brought back to Australia in July 1901. He married Anna von Thien on the 21st of April 1902 at Germanton, which is now called Holbrook, in New South Wales. He was 32 and Anna was 10 years younger than Francis. He worked on farms in towns northwest of Albury and moved to Wagga in later years. He died in Wagga on the 25th of November 1837, aged 61. They had 8 children. 2 sons, Clarence and Frank, enlisted in World War II in the Navy. Clarence died on the 1st of March 1942 when the HMAS Perth sunk in the battle on the Sundra Strait in the Java Sea. 352 crew in total were lost when the HMAS Perth sunk. Clarence had only married 10 months before his death, and he didn't get to meet his son, who was born on the 15th of February 1942. Frank was a stoker on the HMS Singapore, and he returned safely after the war. So despite Annie having quite a rough start, coming out as a convict with 2 children on board, and then running into trouble with the law, those 2 sons that survived went on to marry and have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of their own, and have continued the Grogan name. I hope you enjoyed my story today. If you have any stories that you would like shared on this podcast, please go to my Facebook page, Family History Mysteries, and message me. Or if you'd like some help in filling out some areas of your family tree, I would be more than happy to help you out.